All right, so this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 4, Rule Britannia, the English Empire, 1660 to 1763. We'll be looking at Section 1, Charles II and the Restoration Colonies. So in this chapter, Chapter 4, we're focusing on these years, 1660 to 1763. And these years are important because England becomes a global economic and military power. So we might say here, England becomes a global economic and military power. Now, of course, for us, what we're mostly concerned with are the colonies in North America. And during these years, the colonies of North America grow pretty significantly in terms of population. But other parts of the English Empire also include the very lucrative sugar colonies in the Caribbean, also includes part of African trade. We might also say that it's during at least the 1700s that the British really carve out a significant part of the slave trade. In some ways, the British supersede the Dutch as commercial leaders around the world. But maybe most importantly is what's sometimes referred to as the crown jewel of the British Empire, and that is their expanding control in India. So England, later what we'll call Great Britain, just in case you're curious. After the year 1707, we refer to England, depending on the context, but really we refer to it as the British Empire. And that is signified by the union between England and Scotland, those two countries together forming Great Britain, Ireland coming later, Wales already included in with England. So if we use these terms interchangeably, sometimes we do, England and Great Britain. If there's any confusion, this is the separating date, right? After 1707, you can refer to like British American relations or British Indian relations. Before 1707, we want to use England. So, for example, to say something like Jamestown was the first British colony, that doesn't really, that wouldn't be very accurate, right? Because at the time, Great Britain didn't exist. So that's just nothing really very important to note, but just in case you were curious, that's where we make the distinction between England and Britain. Again, I'll be using these terms interchangeably. So we're picking up in this chapter on this year here, 1660, and that's a very important year. Well, maybe not very important, but just an important year when it comes to the English colonization of the New World. And that is where England goes through the process of restoring the English monarch. Charles II, we will call him the restored King of England. And if you don't recall the entire backstory behind it, we'll go through it in a second. But after Charles is restored as the King of England in 1660, he creates a number of new colonies. We refer to these as the Restoration Colonies. So we might say about these are the colonies created after English King is restored in 1660. And many of these colonies were created for the purpose of rewarding people who had been loyal to Charles and the monarchy during the very chaotic English Civil War. So the English Civil War was something that we talked about earlier. Just to give kind of a brief rundown of it, the English Civil War was between the monarch at the time. That monarch was Charles I versus Parliament, right? A group of nobles and Oliver Cromwell, who you see pictured right here. This is Cromwell. He was, in some sense, we'll just call him the military dictator of the Parliament. And that is to say that during the English Civil War, Charles I, the father of Charles II, was beheaded and killed. In the English Civil War, it was Parliament that ended up winning, right? Parliament won the war. But the war itself actually ended in 1649. So technically, if we want to get very specific about here, we would say that the war itself ended in 1649. And from about 1649 to 1660, we call this the period of the English Interregnum. So this is 1649 to 1660. The English Interregnum is the period of no king. And that was because during these years, it was Oliver Cromwell who ruled England as a military dictator. As soon as Cromwell died in 1658, his son attempted to gain control of England, or really failed in gaining control of England, and Parliament decided to invite back Charles II. So, in short, right, the English Civil War was won by the parliamentarians. There was an experiment of ruling without a king, right, a period of no king. That failed miserably, and Parliament called upon the son of the dead king, Charles II, to resume the throne, which he did. This is known as the Restoration. Restoration colonies, we already know what those are. Most of these colonies were proprietary colonies, meaning that a proprietary colony is a colony that is the property of one or more people. In other words, these were colonies that essentially whoever was given that proprietary authorization by the king could pretty much run the colony however they wanted to. We're going to focus mostly on 3 different colonies here, and it'll give us kind of a good idea of some of the ways that England continued to colonize the New World. This is Charles II, pictured right here, if you're wondering who that is. But what's interesting about some of the English colonies is that, number one, or the first thing to take note of, and maybe we'll just put this kind of on the side, is the diverse nature of them. There will eventually be 13 colonies that create the United States. All of those 13 colonies have very different purposes, origins. They're almost as if they're like 13 separate countries. So there's a lot of variation, although some similarities. And then number 2, for many of these colonies, there's a plan and also a reality that sets in. So first, let's look at the Carolinas. So the Carolina colony was created by a royal charter to reward loyal supporters of Charles II, right? We might say loyal supporters of Charles II. To help you remember, the capital of the Carolina colony was named Charlestown. How appropriate. However, the Carolina colony was rather big, and it ended up devolving mostly into 2 separate parts. A split between the northern part of the colony, which would later on become North Carolina, and the southern part of the colony, which would later on become South Carolina. So initially, there was just one Carolina colony, and then it split into 2, right? So then there was the creation of North Carolina and the creation of South Carolina. Now, North Carolina got most or many or some of their migrants from other Chesapeake colonies or other colonies nearby. So a lot of servants from Maryland and Virginia, when their terms were over, moved to the northern part of Carolina. They brought tobacco with them. And so the northern part of Carolina tended to look a little bit more like Virginia and Maryland. We might say similar to the Chesapeake colonies, right? Similar to the Chesapeake colonies. Whereas South Carolina tended to look a little bit more like the West Indies. Those were the sugar plantations that relied very heavily upon African slavery, much more so than the colonies of Maryland and Virginia. One good example of this is that South Carolina in the English colonies was the only colony where African slaves outnumbered free white inhabitants. So we might say about South Carolina, we'll say African slavery, we'll say brought to South Carolina. We'll also say outnumbered. And this was the only English colony in North America that had more African slaves than free white inhabitants. So outnumbered free white inhabitants. Many of the people who moved to South Carolina were former servants that were kicked out of the Caribbean or the West Indies. The West Indies is simply just another word for the Caribbean islands. But they grew rice there, sort of a different style of or different version of slavery than you saw in places like North Carolina. So initially, this plan to create just simply one Carolina colony ended up creating two different Carolina colonies, both primarily producing cash crops, both exporting goods, both relying on African slavery, but having some slight differences between the two, namely the types of crops that were grown, tobacco in the north and rice in the south. Similar to other English colonies, the settlers of the Carolina colony also came into contact with native groups that lived there. The Yamasee were the local Native Americans to that particular area. So were the Creek. So we might just say local tribes in Carolina, or where the Carolina colonies were created. Tensions between the Yamasee and the English settlers, especially over land, resulted in the Yamasee War, 1715 to 1718. We see here in this conflict how native tribal rivalries factor in. It was only when another tribe, the Cherokee, allied themselves with the English that allowed for English victory. So much like some of the other conflicts that we've talked about in the other English colonies, for example, if you're thinking about a theme about English colonization of what ties all these colonies together, conflicts with Native Americans certainly would be one of those. We witnessed that with Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, the Pequot and King Philip's War in New England, and now the Yamasee War here in the Carolina colonies. Another restoration colony we're going to talk about is New York. We're not really going to talk about New Jersey here because New York will do pretty much what we need to. And that is to show some of the ways that New York differed from other English colonies and see how the plan in creating New York didn't ultimately result in the finished product. So one thing that we have to keep in mind from the previous chapters is that this geography was previously controlled by the Netherlands. New York, before it became New York, was New Netherlands. We might make a note. New Netherland turned into New York. And that was because the English and the Dutch went to war in the 1600s, 1650s, and the 1670s, This was a war for commercial meaning trade, commercial supremacy, war for commercial supremacy. After the English successfully beat the Dutch on a number of fronts, the wars themselves actually went pretty much back and forth, but during one of the phases, the Dutch, or the Netherlands, more or less gave New Netherland to the English. Recall, for the Dutch, that New Netherland wasn't very largely populated, didn't really make a lot of money compared to their other colonies, and so they parted with it pretty quickly. Charles II gave the colony to his brother, James, the Duke of York, and renamed it New York for James. James, for the most part, ruled New York like a king. But most of the inhabitants there didn't really like that or didn't appreciate that. They eventually got past the Charter of Liberties, which established a representative government represent government. And this is going to be one of those themes, again, that eventually will tie pretty much all the English colonies together. Is that even though they take different routes to the same destination, by the time of the American Revolution, pretty much every single English colony has some sort of representative government. James, the Duke of York, ruling New York like a king was very unpopular. People demanded representative government, and in 1683 that happened. Now, one thing that Great Britain, I guess at this point, England, inherits from New Netherland and the Dutch is a very diverse population. Recall that the Netherlands or New Netherland really didn't have a very strong affiliation for one nationality over the other and had a decree of religious toleration. So we might say about the diversity of New York is that there are more nationalities and more religions, really, than a lot of other colonies at the time. Although when the English take over, there's a little bit of cracking down on it, but not much. Unlike some of the other conflicts between English settlers and other tribal groups, the Five Nations of the Iroquois, a confederation of tribes in the area, including the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. We might say of these tribes formed a confederacy and maintained neutrality with England and the Dutch, right? England and the Dutch. We'll talk more about the Iroquois. The Iroquois will be known as one of the most powerful Native American confederations in North America during this revolutionary era. So we might say about the Iroquois, we'll just call them the most powerful Native group interacting with English settlers. We'll talk more about them in later chapters. So again, in the case of New York, there was, again, an initial plan, James to rule as a king. People demanded otherwise, and there was representative government created. Lastly, we're going to talk about Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania in some ways is the most unique colony. It ends up being, in the long run, the most popular of all the colonies. Whereas New York and Carolina were given to loyal supporters of Charles II. Pennsylvania was given to William Penn, who essentially the king had owed his father money. And so a way to pay off the debt of William Penn's father, Charles II gave William Penn the colony of Pennsylvania. So William Penn, will call him the founder of Pennsylvania. Here you see William Penn right here, right? Kind of looks like the Quaker Oat guy. And that is because William Penn was a Quaker. Now, I don't think that we've talked about Quakers in a lot of detail yet, but the belief system for Quakers has a pretty strong influence on shaping the colony of Pennsylvania. So first of all, what is Quakerism? Quakerism is a Protestant religion, right? So they fall on the Protestant side of the Protestant Reformation. Relatively small in number, like the Puritans in some ways, but maybe even more persecuted than the Puritans. There was actually a time period where a number of Quakers were actually killed in the Massachusetts colony for their belief. The Society of Friends is sometimes what the organization of Quakers is called, so we might say this is just a name. Another name for the Quakers, basically. But most important to the Quaker belief system is this idea of the inner light. And that is the idea, kind of like a soul, you can think of it as. But the idea is that everyone has an inner light. Everyone has an inner light. And, you just need to kind of cultivate it in order to bring it out. Now, the real sort of radical part about this and what set the Quakers apart is the emphasis not on the soul or the inner light, but the emphasis on the everyone. And the idea was that men, women, Englishmen, people who are Native American, Africans, everybody potentially has this inner light in them. And what that reflected in Quaker society was this sort of version of radical social equality, which was very much not the rule for the day. And some of the reasons as to why the Quakers received a lot of heat. That was sort of this, spiritual belief of equality where, there was anything but. You could compare it to, for example, we already know, compare it to some of the societies in the Caribbean with African slavery, the slave codes, where there's certainly no racial equality there. The Quakers, very, very early on, are sort of already at odds with slavery. Some of them are very uncomfortable, even advocating getting rid of it, especially early on. And that is due to the sort of belief in the inner light. This was true between men and women. So you compare the Quakers to the Puritan church. In the Puritan church, really men were only able to hold any sort of legal or spiritual authority. In the Quaker church, men and women could both speak out. And in European society, this really put them at odds with the nobility. So there was a certain refusal to recognize, we'll say, social status. Right? We'll put nobility. So, for example, in a place like England, if someone's a noble, you got to call them like a lord or baron or some sort of fancy title. And the Quakers refused to do that, saying that, we're all kind of in this same spiritual boat together. And that was some of the reason for why the Quakers received so much persecution. They were not willing to play that game, so to speak. That reflected a little bit in the creation of the Pennsylvania colony, in which no official church was established. This was a bit different than some of the other English colonies which had official churches. So, for example, in Virginia, the official church was the Church of England. In Massachusetts, it was Puritanism. In Plymouth, it was the Pilgrims. But this no official church ultimately led to more religious toleration, and this meant that more people moved to Pennsylvania. Again, one of the reasons as to why it was or did become the most popular colony, and the most people moving there. Pennsylvania also had relatively friendly relations with the Native Americans, and that was due to another belief system, which was pacifism, which is another Quaker belief. Pacifism, is a refusal to use violence. So for the Quaker settlers of Pennsylvania, if violence is not on the table, then you better work extra hard to try to maintain friendly relations. And so we might say friendly native relations relative to other English colonies. Now that doesn't mean that everything was hunky-dory. You had other settlers, other migrants from other parts of the world that moved into Pennsylvania and did cause problems, but Pennsylvania didn't have a militia early on, and that was in part due to the pacifist nature. So if you can understand some of the base belief systems about the Quakers, or at least remember, this idea of an inner light, this idea of spiritual equality, the refusal to use violence, it can help you get to some of the other positions that the Quakers have and some of the things that are characteristic of the Pennsylvania colony. Places like Philadelphia became the most populated city in the colony, so we might say Philadelphia became the most populated colonial city. Initially it was Massachusetts and the Puritans where the most English people initially landed. Massachusetts becomes surpassed by these middle colonies, as we call them, Pennsylvania and New York a little bit later. One great example of this is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a Puritan, so we might say born a Puritan, sort of moved away from this very rigid, very strict belief system and eventually moved to Philadelphia. We'll talk a little bit more later about Benjamin Franklin and why he really embodies in a lot of ways kind of this this enlightened American citizen, but he was initially born a Puritan, kind of representing an older way of English colonial life going off to die, and kind of a newer one based off of commerce and knowledge and information from across the Atlantic, ultimately tying the colonies in with the larger part of the world. And, speaking of the growth of commerce, another very important development occurs in this colonial era between the colonies and the empire, and that is the creation of the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts, in short, right, we'll say here, are British laws that, you might guess it right here, restrict colonial trade. And this, of course, was done under the premise of mercantilist policy, which we talked about in a previous chapter. Let's just recall that in terms of mercantilist policy, what we want to say here is that in terms of the colonial relationship, pretty much colonies could only trade with the mother country. Right, that's the idea. So this sometimes helps this visualization, right? So if we have a colony, we have a mother country, we'll call this mother country. I mean, this is pretty much what the mercantilist system tried to encourage. No trading with any other countries, nowhere else, just the colony and the mother country going back and forth. Now, the reason why this is, one of the reasons why the Navigation Acts are important, and there are various ways of doing that, right? So it could just be a flat out restriction on trading with other nations. A lot of times it involves raising taxes on foreign goods, kind of forcing colonists to buy goods from the mother country. But the reason why it's important was because this was one of the first efforts by the English crown, in this case, or the British Parliament, to try and control the trade of the colonial world. Now, it had a few consequences. First and foremost was the fact that illegal trading replaced what was legal trading before, rather than only creating a system where the colonies traded with the mother country. Instead, colonies would go to other countries like France, but now would only do it illegally. We call that smuggling. Smuggling is illegal trade. And one common thing, or one common avenue of illegal trade, was that French sugar bought from places like Haiti was purchased by New Englanders and turned into rum, right? So essentially, if we were going to look at this category here, we might say, actually, this arrow's going the wrong direction, so we'll erase it. But pretty much the illegal trade that was taking place was that sugar was going from France, and then the colony itself would turn the sugar into rum and just sell the rum to whoever it wanted to, including maybe even the mother country as well. Maybe they're going to trade rum back to France, right? In other words, this was illegal. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it really propped up the northern colonies. We might say New England rum, or just of smuggling in general. It really was one of the few avenues that the northern or New England colonies had, because recall, the New England colonies weren't really built to make money. So we might say smuggling propped, or we'll say was vital to New England colonies. The Navigation Acts and other trade restrictions also set up vice admiralty courts. These were courts with no jury, right? Courts with no jury. So if you were accused of smuggling, you didn't get, in the eyes of the colonists, what was seen as a fair trial. Customs agents were given writs of assistance. This is a warrant to search colonial ships. So customs agents, or British enforcers, could essentially board whatever ship they wanted, accuse people of smuggling, and then be put on trial with no jury and be deemed guilty. So in the eyes of the colonists, this was, not just bad economic policy, but this was unjust. Now, here's the kicker. For the most part, when these navigation acts go into effect, roughly the late 1600s, the British failed to enforce them. They're not very strict about it. We call this salutary neglect. This is the British failure to enforce the navigation acts. Right? In fact, when it really came to enforcing these acts, we'll go all the way back up to the top here. The British were more focused on, let's see, these colonies in the Caribbean, because it was the Caribbean colonies that made the most money. The North American colonies weren't really focused on all that much. And this becomes a problem, right? Because when we roll around to the 1750s, so, almost 70 years later or so, the British do eventually try to enforce those laws. And when they enforce those laws, it, to say the least, it's going to make a lot of people unhappy.